work.
Let me ask you a simple question. Can I ask you a simple question?
If it's hard, I can't answer.
Okay, so let me ask a simple question. How many cups of wine do you have to have at the Seder?
4.
Is that your final answer? Everybody seems very confident that you have 4 cups of wine at the Seder.
Yeah, that's my final answer.
Okay, let's test. Let's test if that's the case. Right, okay.
But then there's
okay, there you go. So you're referencing that there are 4 expressions of redemption, and then when you look a little bit closer, there's a 5th expression of redemption. So I come back to my question. How many cups of wine do you have at the Seder?
But we don't drink that.
So had I asked you how many cups of wine do you drink at the Seder?
But Rabbi, you said you answered easy questions.
had I said how many cups of wine do you drink at the Seder, then the correct answer is 4 cups of wine. However, there is another cup of wine that you have at the Seder. Okay? And we call it what? Kos shel Eliyahu. We call it Elijah's cup. So what we're going to examine is 2 things. Number 1, how did it get its name? Number 2, which we'll actually look at first before we see how the cup of Elijah got its name, the question of, is that the original custom? And this is a fascinating topic because there are customs that have evolved over the course of Jewish history. We have the way we do the custom today, and we just assume that that's how it's always been. It's not necessarily the case. So the question is, was that the original custom to pour a cup of Elijah? So let's go back and look at classical sources, see what they say. We'll look at the Rambam as a start, because one beautiful thing amongst many of the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, his Encyclopedia of Jewish Law, is that he covers topics that are not necessarily always covered in other books, and that his language is so precise and so carefully chosen that when you read whatever the law or custom is in the Rambam's language, it will give you more insight than colloquially, or what we know either in practice or even from reading the Shulchan Aruch. So here's what the Rambam says, and immediately, as soon as you hear the language that he uses, it's going to start you thinking, is this what we do? So he goes through the order of the Pesach Seder, and he describes the fact that there are 4 cups of wine that we're supposed to drink. And then, if you've ever looked at how the Rambam goes through the process, he goes first through all of the laws associated with Pesach, and then at the end, he goes through, this is the order of the Seder night. So even if that includes revisiting things that he's already told us in the generalized halachic sense, here he goes into the specifics. This is the order of events on the Seder night. In that order of events, one of the things that the Rambam tells us is, and the language here again is very, very intriguing. He says one should, you hear that? One should pour a 5th cup of wine and have that cup of wine for what he calls Hallel Hagodol. Now, you know, if you look at the Pesach Seder, we do half of Hallel before the meal. The remainder of Hallel we do after the meal. And then we do a paragraph out of Tehillim, which is Hoidu Lashem ki toiv ki la'olam chastoi. Hoidu lelekei hoilikim ki. 26 verses of praise to Hashem. It's actually part of what we say on the Shabbos morning as well during the course of the davening. And that is called Hallel Hagodol. That's what it's called. It's called the Great Hallel. So the Rambam says you should pour yourself a 5th cup of wine and then do this Hallel Hagodol. And then he says, and this cup is not obligatory like the other 4 cups, which is a little bit confusing. So are you saying that it is obligatory, just not like the other 4 cups? Or are you saying it is not obligatory, unlike the other 4 cups? And the fact that he started off the conversation by saying one should pour that 5th cup of wine, that makes it sound like you don't really have to. Like it's a nice thing to do. The other thing is, he doesn't tell us what you do with that 5th cup of wine, other than the fact that you read that Hallel Hagodol. But he's left it ambiguous if you're supposed to drink that cup of wine or not drink that cup of wine. Now we know, of course, that when we pour the cup for Eliyahu, we don't drink it. So is that what the Rambam was speaking about? This is what we're going to have to unpack. And as I say, see if the custom as we perform it is the same as the custom was hundreds of years ago, like, for example, in the Rambam's times. So this is part of what we're going to discuss, and it becomes a very intriguing conversation because, as is often the case, there are commentaries commenting on the Rambam, and they give their perspectives on what the Rambam is actually saying, okay, which we'll see in just a moment.
I could maybe give you a simple answer to that. They had a Seder in Israel, in Egypt, and certainly in the desert.
Right.
Elijah wasn't born.
Okay, good point.
So
But by the time the Rambam came around, Elijah was born. And interestingly, the Rambam does not use that expression. He says a fifth cup. He does not say a cup for Elijah. Now, that's getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because we'll come back to that a little bit later. But it's just an interesting point to consider. So you're saying that in the original version of Pesach, which was for many generations, there was no Elijah to speak of yet because he was only going to be born late. It's a very good point. So obviously they didn't have a cup for Elijah. True. We're looking at a point in history which is after Elijah was already around, but obviously hundreds of years before us. And the Rambam does not use the expression Elijah. So that's part of what we're going to have to explore. We're just not there yet. Instead, where we are is going one step before the Rambam. So what comes before the Rambam? What would he have based his interpretation on? The Gemara. Or the Mishnah, on which the Gemara expounds. So you go back to the Mishnah, which is in the tractate Pesachim, not surprisingly, the section that talks about all the laws of Pesach. And there you have two views. You have the view of the Rabbanon. Anytime we use the Rabbanon, we're effectively speaking about the collaborative, the majority of voices at the time, even if we don't name who they are. And on the other hand, you have an individual dissenting voice that is Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon is a student colleague of Rabbi Akiva. So according to the sages tell us that you drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. That is the obligation. Now, before we go into what Rabbi Tarfon says, you already know where this is going, because if that's what the sages say, and they're the majority view, and we know that in Judaism you always follow the majority view, that's obviously what we're going to do in practice. You drink 4 cups of wine. But then there is this opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, and he says, well, actually, you're supposed to drink 5 cups of wine at the Pesach Seder. Now, we've never heard that before, right? That there's an opinion who says you drink 5 cups. We haven't heard that. We've heard, and we know what we do in practice. We drink 4 glasses of wine. We also know that at the meal, you're entitled to drink additional wine if you wish to, but that's got nothing to do with the obligation. That's purely just if you want to drink wine at the meal. But the obligation is to drink 4 cups of wine, and we know that we then pour a 5th cup of wine, which is the cup for Elijah, that nobody touches and nobody drinks. We've never yet heard that there's an opinion, in this case it's Rabbi Tarfon's opinion, that you're supposed to drink 5 cups of wine. So that's a surprise. But like I said, if you've got a majority view and you've got an individual view, who will we follow in practice? Majority. So we know that what we're supposed to do is drink 4 cups of wine. You also know that if the majority says you drink 4 cups of wine, then when the Gemara discusses this Mishnah, it's all going to be a conversation in the context of how many cups of wine are you supposed to drink? 4. And then we'll go through the details. When do you drink them? Do you have to say a bracha 4 times, borei pri hagafen, or do you just say it once, as we know? Right? Those are the things we're going to discuss. But the conversation will all be in the context that you drink 4 cups of wine, right? And yet, the Gemara, believe it or not, also discusses what would you be saying in the same way as you say Kiddush with the 1st cup of wine, and you read the Haggadah with the 2nd cup of wine, and you bench with the 3rd cup of wine, and you say the remainder of Hallel and the songs of praise to Hashem with the 4th cup of wine. The Gemara says, well, what would you say with the 5th cup of wine? And it tells us Hallel Haggadol. That's where the Rambam got it from. So that's weird, because if you follow the majority that there are only 4 cups of wine, why are you having a conversation about what you would say on the 5th cup of wine? There is no 5th cup of wine. We've already established that. We follow the majority view, and we only have 4 cups of wine. So that's also an intriguing question that we're going to have to unpack. So what we've got so far, before we get to that question, is we've got to try and understand what did the Rambam intend when he said you should pour a 5th cup of wine, rather than saying you are obligated to pour a 5th cup of wine. Let's try and understand that first. So there are commentators on the Rambam. We'll have a look at one of them, and then we'll have a look at one of the Rambam's almost contemporaries and the perspective that he gives, which also seems to align with the Rambam, and we'll see if either opinion actually works. So the first opinion is this. Basically, what the Rambam is telling us is, you're supposed to drink 4 cups of wine at the Seder. We know that. Now let me ask you, after you've had the 4th cup of wine, what are the rules? After you've finished the 4th cup of wine, what are the rules? You bench actually before the 4th cup of wine, but you have to say the after bracha for the 4th cup of wine. And in many Haggadahs, there's a little line of text after you've had the 4th cup of wine that says, after the 4th cup of wine, one should not eat or drink anything until the morning. And the only exception is water. Okay? The only exception is water. So what's the Rambam saying over here? That you should pour. Now in Hebrew, the word v'yesh loi, which translates as you should do X, can also be translated as you may do X. V'yesh loi, you have the right to pour a 5th cup of wine. So the first interpretation of the Rambam sounds like the Rambam is telling us that what happens if you finish the meal and whatever time your Seder ends, you are incredibly thirsty after the Seder.
You can drink wine, water.
You can say you can drink water, right? But we live in the modern world where you just turn on the tap and you can drink water. Or you've got a bottle of something in your fridge. In their times, you had to draw water from the well. And maybe you didn't have water at 1 a.m. readily available to drink. But maybe you had some wine left from the Seder. And you're really thirsty. Or maybe your throat is dry from all the matzah. And you just need a little bit of liquid in your system. So the first interpretation of the Rambam is, yesh loi, you have the right to have a little bit more wine. If you need to. It's not ideal, but if you need to, for whatever reason, I've just given you a couple of examples, there might be other examples, you need to have a little bit to drink. Gesundheit, yesh loi, you're allowed to now have a 5th cup of wine, but you can't just have a cup of wine. You have to turn it into an extension of the Seder. So if you were going to have a swig of water, Gesundheit, do whatever you want. Water is not going to kill, because one of the things is you've got to keep the taste of the matzah, the afikomen, and the wine in your mouth. It's supposed to be like a lingering Seder experience. Don't worry, most of us, by the time we've eaten that amount of matzah, it is a lingering Seder experience. So, but the idea is that you're not supposed to kind of cancel the flavor of the matzah and the wine in your system. Water's not really going to do that. Okay, you want to have some water? Have some water. You don't need to do anything. But if what you're going to drink after the Seder is more wine, then you have to turn it into an extension of the Seder experience, and then you have to say, Hallel HaGadol. Because now you're not just drinking wine for your own pleasure, you're drinking wine as part of the 2 main themes of the Seder, which is to give praise to Hashem and to acknowledge the miracles specifically of the Exodus. Now that's what Hallel HaGadol does. If you go through the Hallel HaGadol, it speaks about general praise of Hashem and specifically the fact that he killed the firstborns and he took us out of Egypt and he split the sea. So it suits the theme of what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And so the first insight in the commentaries on the Rambam is not telling you that you are required to have a 5th cup of wine. Rather, he's addressing a practical issue. Let's say that a person is, for whatever reason, in a situation that they have to have some more wine after the Seder. This is the correct way to do it. Sounds like a good explanation, right? And it kind of fits with that expression, yesh loi, which could be translated as, you have the right. You have the right to drink a 5th cup of wine in this particular context if you create this ritual around it. There's only one problem with that. I mean, it's a beautiful explanation, and it sounds really practical. But there is one problem. And that is, for anybody who's familiar with the style, the writing style that the Rambam uses, his intention is always to be as clear as possible. The Rambam avoids ambiguity wherever possible. So, what that means is, if the Rambam wants you to know that there is a law that you are allowed to drink the word for allowed is mutar, that you are permitted to drink more wine as long as you follow these steps. You know what he would have said? He wouldn't have said yeshloi, which is an ambiguous term that could mean either you have the right to or yeshloi, you should. He would have just said mutarloi, you're permitted. And then he would have said, in these circumstances, if you follow these steps. But he didn't say that, which leads you to believe that that's not what he's saying. He's not telling us just simply that you have the right to have another cup of wine in this particular context. Plus, what else did the Rambam say? He said this fifth cup is not obligatory like the other four. He could have just really simply said, this fifth cup is not obligatory. Why does he say like the other four cups? That gives the impression that actually there's a reason to have this fifth cup of wine. Because if it's just a matter of us saying, listen, you're in a situation where you need to drink something else, so we're going to create a format for you, then he would have just said, have the cup of wine in these steps. But the minute he says it's not as obligatory as the other four cups, that implies that there is some level of requirement to have this fifth cup of wine, and that's a big question. So in that case, we'll take another angle. And that is from Rabbeinu Nissim, otherwise known as the Ran, who is a medieval commentator on the Gemara, also from a similar region in the world to the Rambam, so that's why I say they're kind of contemporaries. And the Ran has a different view. The Ran, now you can hear echoes of Rabbi Tarfon's opinion in what the Ran says. He says, the mitzvah on Pesach is to have 4 cups of wine. Mitzvah mina muvchar, which means the ultimate best gold standard of how to do this mitzvah, is to have a 5th cup of wine as well. Now let's admit, we've never heard that before. Nobody has ever, in all of the years that we've been doing a Pesach Seder, suggested to us, no rabbi ever got up in shul and said, have 4 cups of wine, but if you really can, it's even better, have 5. Nobody ever told us that. Some people around this table are disappointed that they were never told this. So the Ran says, mitzvah min hamufchar. That's how you're supposed to read this. There's the view of the sages, which is the majority view, and that's what we follow in practice, that you have 4 cups of wine. But you can't completely ignore what Rabbi Tarfon had to say, that there's an argument for a 5th cup of wine. So therefore, the ideal, the best way in which to have the cup of wine is, or the cups of wine is to have 5. Let me ask you, does it sound like that's what the Rambam is saying? The Rambam's language is v'yeshloi, which could either be interpreted as you have the rights to have a 5th cup, or yeshloi, you should have a 5th cup. Does that sound the same as saying mitzvah mina muvchar, that it's the best way to do the mitzvah? Doesn't sound like it, right? Again, the Rambam avoids ambiguity. So whatever he's going to tell us in the most direct way. And we know that there are multiple places in his writings where the Rambam is quite comfortable to use that expression, mitzvah min hamuvchar, that the best way to do something. Or he might use the expression hamahadrin, those people who want to go beyond the requirement of the law, follow these steps. If, in fact, the Rambam took the same view as the Ran, which is that there is a standard of the night of Pesach, which is to have 4 cups, and then there's a gold standard, which is to have 5 cups, he would have used that language. He would have told us, mitzvah min hamuvchar, the ideal way to do this is to have another cup. Take it one step further. The expression mitzvah min hamuvchar, this might be a little bit technical, so I hope it won't be too confusing. The title mitzvah min hamuvchar means something very specific. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's say that there is a mitzvah, any mitzvah, that you're supposed to do. There are always 2 parts to that mitzvah. There is the chefza, that means the actual parameters of the mitzvah. Then there is the gavra, which means the person and their attitude towards the mitzvah. So, for example, in order to fulfill the mitzvah of saying the Shema properly, the Gemara tells us, as long as you concentrate on the meaning of the words for the first line of Shema Yisrael, you've done the mitzvah. But what happens if you decide that you want to do more than just the first line? You actually want to concentrate on the meaning of the words for the entire Shema. Now, there are 2 things that happen over here. The first thing is, you as a person, you have invested further in this mitzvah than the guy next to you who's just focused on the first line and doing his, echad, whatever it is, to tell the world that he's concentrating on the first line. You, as an individual, you have done more. Is your Shema a so-called better Shema than his?
No.
No. Your experience is a deeper experience than his. So now, at the Pesach Seder, are my cups of wine better if I have 5? Or is it just me doing more if I have 5? In other words, the expression mitzvah mina mufchar is where something about the mitzvah changes, not just something about my commitment changes. Okay? And it doesn't sound like, we'll unpack this further, please God, tomorrow. Doesn't sound like, in this case, moving from 4 to 5 cups of wine is going to fundamentally change the nature of the mitzvah, although it might change my enthusiasm for the mitzvah. So again, does not sound like this is what the Rambam is trying to convey, which brings us back to our original question. What was their original custom? Before we get to what our custom is to have the Elijah cup, what was their original custom? If you could teleport back to the time of the Rambam or back to the time of the Gemara and you were sitting at their Seder, would it look the same as our Seder? Or would they have a 5th cup of wine? That's what we still have to unpack and try to work out.